But what we will do is we'll have each speaker have a 12-minute introduction, after which there'll be half an hour for a discussion between the two of them. And finally, we will open up the floor for questions and answers from all of you. In this fast-paced world that we currently live in, and this world where we have a tremendous amount of overload of information, often we're left questioning sometimes the very basics and the foundations of what we believe. And we look around society and we see every single aspect of society is being challenged intellectually on a number of different levels. And it can be incredibly confusing. We're going to add a little bit to that confusion, but hopefully in a way that can open up your mind to a number of really important questions. Dr. Vervaake's work and Sheikh Hamza's background will provide an interesting analysis of the intersections between spirituality, between reason, between consciousness, between understanding. And these are concepts and understandings that we need to be able to engage with, particularly in a world where people are being overloaded with information, but perhaps losing understanding of logic. And sometimes the popularity of nationalist politicians around the world is kind of showing this lack of engagement with logic and understanding. And this is why it's incredibly important to talk about these types of subjects. Dr. Vervaeke has been teaching at the University of Toronto since 1994. He currently teaches in the Cognitive Science program, the Psychology department, the Psychology and Mental Health program. He has won and been nominated for several teaching awards, including the 2001 Students Administrative Council and Association of Part-Time Undergraduate Students Teaching Award for the Humanities, the 2012 Rajni Ghosh Excellence in Teaching Award. His most recent publications include Relevance, Realization, the Emerging Framework in Cognitive Science, and a forthcoming chapter entitled Relevance, Meaning, and the Cognitive Science of Wisdom. His research interests are relevance, realization, insight, problem-solving, general intelligence, consciousness, mindfulness, rationality, and wisdom. Hamza Tzortzis is the author of The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and the Mirage of Atheism. He is a public speaker, instructor, and essayist. He has a master's and postgraduate certificate in philosophy from the University of London. He's currently continuing his postgraduate studies in the field. Hamza has studied Islamic thought and theology under qualified scholars. He has delivered workshops, courses, and accredited diploma courses on topics related to Islamic thought and philosophy. Please give both of our speakers a big hand of applause. Tonight is meant to be a discussion and a dialogue, not a debate. It's not meant to be a gotcha, I caught you saying something. It's meant to be a dialogue and a discussion. And to everyone here, I would encourage you to have an open mind. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-hikmah dhalat al-mu'min," that wisdom is the lost belonging of the believer. So wherever you find wisdom, whether it comes from a Muslim source or not, the wisdom belongs to you. It is your lost belonging. You should take it. So approach this discussion with an open mind and listen to both of our speakers with the best of your listening ability. And since Dr. Vervaeke is our guest, we're going to start hopefully with him.
Thank you very much. First of all, I agree with the format that you've explained, and I felt very well treated and last time, and so I wanted to thank everybody for that. And we both had a very enjoyable time. So I want to talk about rationality because it's what I do work on, and so I have a video series out now called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis because of the issues that are pervasive in our society that are pointed to, that people are hungry for meaning in very important ways. And the thing I want to talk about is how rationality should be reconnected to that project, the projects of wisdom and the project of the cultivation of meaning in life. And that what we have, especially if you see how it's portrayed by certain people in the internet and on YouTube, we have a very thin notion of rationality. A very thin notion of rationality that is very much a post-Enlightenment notion and is not well allied to, in fact, I would say it's disconnected to the ancient notion of wisdom that we find within the Socratic and Platonic paradigms. And because Socrates thought that kind of wisdom was worth dying for, the unexamined life is not worth living, because of its deep connection to meaning in life. I'm proposing and arguing for that we need to return to this more ancient notion of rationality in order to get from it that functionality of affording the cultivation of wisdom and the cultivation of meaning in life that are so desperately needed in our society today. So that's what my work is. Now, that sounds like kind of a sort of, whoa, kind of topic, but it's actually a topic for which I can do a lot of work as a scientist. And so that's what I'm bringing to bear. So let me just try and give you an idea, first of limited time, so I'm asking for everybody's forbearance. More will come out, of course, in the discussion. So this is going to be very gisty in nature. But what's the model of rationality that I'm arguing against as being too thin? Well, there's a couple aspects to it. The first is that there's two things that rationality is regularly confused with, often treated as if these terms were synonymous. And there is good argument and very good, a lot, and if we have time we'll go into it, empirical evidence that both of these confusions are in fact that. They're misidentifications. One is to identify rationality with the capacity for being logical. That is a mistake. For reasons I can get into a little bit later, trying to equate rationality with logicality is actually a deep mistake for a very quick reason. That we are in what's Cherniak and others and the work that I've done on relevance realization, what's called the finitary predicament. So we cannot pay attention to the vast amount of information that's available to us moment by moment. We cannot access all of the vast amounts of information that's available to us in our long-term memory. We cannot calculate all the possible permutations that we need to engage in if we're going to engage in even the basic action. This overlaps with things called the frame problem and the relevance problem. And what that means is if you tried to logic your way through almost all of your behavior, you would very quickly exhaust all of your resources, all your computational resources, all your cognitive resources. So what that means is that if you were to try to be like Data or Mr. Spock, you would commit a very easily, it's very easy to show you would commit a very deep and profound kind of cognitive suicide. You would cease to exist as a cognitive agent. That means that the relationship between rationality and logic is much more complex than simple identity. Of course, I'm not saying that you can be illogical and be rational. What I'm saying is that rationality, think of the word ratio, rationing. Rationality is about knowing how, when, and to what degree you should be logical. And that's a much more difficult thing to theorize about and also to study, which makes it wonderful for somebody who wants a job, right, as a professor. The other thing that rationality is often confused with is intelligence. So that you can be it means, the reason why you're behaving irrationally is because you're not very intelligent. This is also a mistake. So this goes to literally 4 decades of work by Keith Stanovich and others, many people, showing that the following is true. Our best measures of how intelligent you are, your general intelligence, are only weakly predictive of our best measures of how rational you are, about a 0.3 of the variance. So what we got, I'm really highly confident in what I'm about to say. Intelligence is at best a necessary but never a sufficient condition for rationality, right? And here's part of the reason why. Because you're in the finitary predicament, which I just described before, and you have to, out of all the information, what are you focusing on? Out of all the ways you could connect it, what are you connecting it to? What are you ignoring? Because a big part of what makes you adaptive and intelligent as a problem solver is actually what you're ignoring right now. That's the thing that it's the hardest to get AI to do well. Ignore irrelevant information and zero in on relevant information. That's the hard problem we're facing right now in AI. Now, what makes you intelligent is that you can do that, and you can do it in a wide variety of domains. But the price you pay for it is the following. The very machinery that makes you so adaptive at zeroing in on relevant information is the same machinery that makes you continually susceptible to self-deception. Because what it does is you have to select what you're going to pay attention to, and that's adaptive. But you know what that also does? That prejudices what you find important or relevant. That's also bias. So what I want to say is, right, intelligence, the very processes that make you adaptive, also make you perennially susceptible to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Let me give you one clean, quick example, okay? If you tried to calculate the actual formal probability of an event, you would be overwhelmed by the computational task. So what do? We rely on two heuristics that bias us. What should we pay attention to? We rely on the availability heuristic. We judge by how easily we can remember an event or imagine it happening, the more probable it is. Or we also use what's called the representativeness heuristic. If an event is very sort of prototypical, it's probably highly probable. Now these are good adaptive things, and here's where you use them. You take your friend to the airport. And they're going to get on a plane. And so you do all these euphemisms for don't die. Like, oh, have a safe trip, or text me when you get there. Because, if the plane's crashing, you can say, wait, we can't crash, I have to text my friend. Right? But we do all this stuff, right? Now, why are we doing it? Because the availability heuristic is, I can easily imagine a plane crashing. It's my whole, my Homo erectus brain, big thing of metal, it'll fall and crash. So it's easy to imagine it. And when it crashes, notice when it's a prototypical event. Nobody ever says there was an accident when a plane crashes. It's a tragedy. It's a disaster. So the availability heuristic is going, and the representative, and don't die. And then the person gets on the plane, the safest mode of transportation there is, and then you, without giving it a second thought, get into your car, the North American death machine. The very machinery that makes you adaptive makes you susceptible to self-deception. So, if rationality is neither being purely logical nor being intelligent, what is it? Well, here's what I want to propose to you. Let's pick up on what I just said. Rationality is a way in which you can use your intelligence recursively on your intelligence to deal with the problem of self-deception. Rather than thinking of rationality as directed primarily to winning arguments in debates, which is what it's becoming, let us link it more closely to the ancient notion of wisdom, where what wisdom is the capacity to see through illusion into what is more real. And what you find is what improves people at being rational is exactly systematic abilities to be comprehensively responsible to being self-deceptive. Now, if you give me that notion of rationality, then I want to point out to you that there are many avenues other than your inferential practices by which you fall into self-deception. The way you pay attention also can be a way in which you fall into self-deception. So in addition to perhaps using some logical techniques to improve your inference, to reduce your self-deception, you would also need things like mindfulness practices to improve your attentional skills so as to reduce self-deception. So and there's other things, so another way in which we are self-deceptive is not our propositional knowing, which is knowing that something is the case, but we can also think about your perspectival knowing. Your perspectival knowing is knowing what it's like to inhabit a particular perspective. I know what it's like to be sober, for example. I know what it's like to be tired. I know what it's like to be having my perspective in contrast to Hamza's. And your perspectival knowing also is relevant to how you're self-deceptive. Because one of the ways you can be pervasively self-deceptive is by being egocentric. Not having a good enough facility at taking other people's perspective. Now you need a training other than logic and other than mindfulness to improve your capacity for improving your perspectival knowing and overcoming self-deception. There's another thing that's very relevant, and this has been brought up by people like Agnes Koller. You also have participatory knowing. This is not the knowing by having a state of cognition, like propositional knowing or procedural knowing of skill, or having a state of consciousness, like perspectival knowing. This is the knowing you have by a state of identity. This is the things you know by becoming them. You know honesty, but only if you become honest. Right? So you aspire to things. Now here's the thing about aspiration. If I'm actually aspiring to be something other than I am, that means I don't currently have the value. That means I can't actually adequately assess the probability, right? So there's a more formal argument about this, and if you want, Hamza, I can give it later. But the gist of the argument is this: you can't infer your way to a future self that has a different set of values and a different way, a different capacity to judge the probability of things. You just can't. So both L.A. Paul and Colleen Agnes Keller have argued that. So this is a process of aspiration where I aspire. And you say, well, what does this have to do with rationality? Well, what she argues is, and she calls it proleptic rationality. Notice something. One of the things I have to aspire to is rationality. If aspiration is not a rational process, then I cannot rationally justify you becoming rational, which defeats rationality. The process of aspiring for rationality has to itself be incorporated in to rationality, which means there is what you might call a developmental transformative rationality, an aspirational, or what she calls proleptic rationality, that we also have to include into our model of rationality. Now, if you have all of these rationalities, and you have them well rationally coordinated together, so they're acting as checks and balances on each other, so that you're massively, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively increasing your capacity to deal with self-deception in a comprehensive and systematically reliable way, I would propose to you that that's a good candidate for wisdom. At least what Plato and Socrates meant by it. And I think we need that today, because we lack it, and our culture is being more and more beset by self-deceptive patterns, both individually and collectively, and we hunger as a culture for meaning in life, and I can give you lots of data on this. The book that Chris and I have written is out there on all of this. Right? We need that, because that kind of rationality, and it's overlapping with wisdom and self-transcendence in development, will give people a way of deeply responding to this desire to be more deeply connected to themselves and to reality. So I'm deeply critical of people who purport to stand for rationality and are actually limiting us to logical manipulation of inferences for purely propositional reasons, so that they can win in a debate for a particular set of beliefs. I oppose that, and I've given you my reasons why. Thank you very much.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Brothers and sisters and friends, I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Professor, that was very insightful. I'm going to try and explore what you said later in our discussion, and maybe through the questions and the answers. So I'm going to talk about something totally different in order for us to enrich the discussion. And I think there's going to be some overlap. So for my work in my research, I've been studying something called Evolutionary Reliabilism. And before I get into that, let me just talk to you about some of the ideas that I've been trying to address. I've recently responded to Michael Deem's relatively recent academic piece, and he's responding to Stitch and Plantinga concerning evolutionary reliabilism. And some of what I'm going to say is what I have basically tried to articulate. So, generally speaking, we all have the ability to infer, to deduce, to postulate, to develop an argument, to suggest. All of these things is premised on the idea that we have relatively reliable cognitive faculties that can produce true beliefs. So, in our discussion today, we haven't come here and we haven't said that, you know what, my cognitive faculties are totally unreliable and they can never produce beliefs that are a representation of the actual state of affairs. I mean, you wouldn't do that. You can't have a discussion. You end up in basically a state of extreme skepticism that there is no knowledge at all, right? So we all have this assumption sitting in this room, hopefully, that we have reliable cognitive faculties to a certain degree. And yes, we know they're unreliable in other areas, but generally speaking, we have reliable cognitive faculties that can produce beliefs that are a representation of the state of affairs. Now, the argument here is that, generally speaking, from a naturalistic point of view, the argument is that that is explained via the Darwinian mechanism. Now, what I'm going to say is not an attempt to rebut or refute the Darwinian mechanism. No, I'm just going to basically show that basically it has limitations in some areas. So the Darwinian mechanism by natural selection basically would say that we have reliable cognitive faculties that can produce reliable true beliefs because natural selection, right, favored reliable cognitive faculties that could produce true beliefs because it was conducive to survival and production. They were fitness enhancing. So in the beginning of this conversation, a Darwinist or someone who adopts that kind of position, or even a naturalist, would say that, you know, there is a necessary link between truth and survival. But I think academics have moved away from this now, and they're saying, well, that's not really true, because there's a whole range of thought experiments that you can articulate that basically breaks the necessary link between truth and survival. For example, O'Hare and O'Brien and many others, they would basically argue that, you know, say you go into a jungle and you're a primate and you have this false belief that has emerged from unreliable cognitive faculties that all fungi are poisonous, right? You end up surviving because you avoid poisonous fungi, but you also avoid nutritious fungi. So it's not necessarily true. There is no necessary link between truth and survival. This is a very obvious point, right? So in the discussions in academia, they've moved on, they've developed a different approach or different strategy, and it's called evolutionary reliabilism. So they've moved away from the idea that there is a necessary link between truth and survival, and they're saying, well, it's probabilistic, meaning it is highly likely, or it is more likely that natural selection selected reliable cognitive faculties that could produce reliable true beliefs over unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs. And this is called evolutionary reliabilism. Now, the problem with this is that if you're going to choose one over the other in this context, and you have to have some kind of evidence, philosophical or empirical. You can't just stay silent and say, yeah, it's okay, we could be evolutionary reliabilists, because that means you have epistemic privilege. You know, why? Given the fact that, you know, these domains of knowledge can't even explain maybe language properly, or the development of language, you can't develop inner subjective conscious states, consciousness properly, then you don't really have that epistemic right to, you know, have epistemic privilege. So you need some kind of empirical evidence or philosophical evidence. Now, the philosophical evidence, in my view, there's a big problem, because it is, if you read the works of the academic James Sage and others, you would see that having reliable cognitive faculties that could produce reliable true beliefs, having those, they would basically drain your biological resources, and it wouldn't be conducive to survival and reproduction, because, you know, your brain needs a lot of glucose, right? And, you know, doing these detailed inferences, even with minimal data, you know, is quite draining. So why would natural selection actually select reliable cognitive faculties that comes at a huge biological cost, right? So from this perspective, there is philosophical evidence, if you like, that would suggest, well, there's no strong reason to believe why natural selection would select reliable cognitive faculties that will produce true beliefs. So the philosophical evidence is neither here or there. Now, if you go to the empirical evidence, well, there's a hell of a lot of empirical evidence out there, but there's nothing substantial, and you could go either way. You could provide evidence for the fact that natural selection was more likely to select reliable cognitive faculties that produce true beliefs over unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs. But there's also evidence for the other way. For example, there's evidence from Donald Hoffman, I believe. He's a cognitive scientist, and he talks about true perceptions, and he looks into genetic algorithms and evolutionary game theory, and he comes to the conclusion that actually having true perceptions is not conducive to survival and reproduction, based on his study. So if you were to rely on that kind of study, then you have to come to the conclusion that we're not really designed to have true perceptions, right? Because in our evolutionary history, it was more likely that natural selection selected the traits that were basically allowed us not to have true perceptions, right? So from this perspective, if you adopt a kind of philosophical naturalistic paradigm, and within that you choose or you decide to say that Darwinism is an explanation of who we are, and I think there's a huge problem. We couldn't really take into account or justify the assumption that we all have, that we've come here today, which is that we have reliable cognitive faculties to a certain degree that can produce reliable true beliefs. And I would say that we need to explore other areas, other domains of knowledge to actually take that assumption seriously, because a particular domain of knowledge that has a particular assumption can only keep that assumption if the domain of knowledge doesn't negate that assumption. But in my view, philosophical naturalism, if they adopt the kind of Darwinian paradigm, actually negates that very assumption. Because from what I've said thus far, one would have to basically conclude skepticism as the appropriate kind of philosophy, which is that there is no knowledge, which could be problematic, but we could explore that further in our discussions. So I wanted to quote the study for you actually, so I didn't want to misquote it. Now, where does God come into this, which is very interesting? So if you take this as a metaphysical exercise, right, because philosophical naturalism is metaphysics really, it's philosophy. Philosophical naturalism, by the way, is the worldview that there is no supernatural, there is no divine, and everything could be explained by physical processes. And a philosophical naturalist will naturally select or choose Darwinism as the current well-confirmed model that would explain who we are. Now, in doing so, you can't ground the assumption that we'll come here today with, which is that we have reliable cognitive faculties that can produce reliable true beliefs, based on what I've discussed thus far. But that's based on an initial philosophical assumption, a metaphysic, a first principle, if you like. Now, from the Islamic spiritual intellectual tradition, obviously we believe in the divine, we believe in God, and that's really our metaphysics. That's our lenses in which we understand the world. So one would argue that under kind of theism, a theistic paradigm, having reliable cognitive faculties that produce true beliefs, it actually makes sense of the fact of who the divine is. The divine is, in the Islamic tradition, al-Hakim, the wise, and al-Alim, the knowing. He has the totality of wisdom and knowledge, right? God has the picture, we just have the pixel, right? So it would make sense by his will and power and the names and attributes I've just discussed, that he created human beings in some way, right? We're not negating, the physical causes of the universe as an explanation for how things emerge, because the Islamic paradigm accepts the asbab, which is the various physical causes, as an explanation for how things work and how things emerge. It's not a problem. So, yeah, so it makes sense that the divine created human beings and with reliable cognitive faculties that could produce true beliefs by virtue of who the divine is, right? So I think from a theistic point of view, we don't really have a problem to, keep that assumption, because our worldview, our perspective, doesn't negate that very assumption. But if you're a philosophical naturalist and you decide to adopt Darwinism as an explanation for everything that makes us human, and in particular in this case, our reliable cognitive faculties that can produce true beliefs, then there's a bit of a sticky wicket here, as we say in Britain, right? Because that would negate, because it negates the very assumption that it holds. And the idea here is you can't have a domain of knowledge that has a particular assumption, yet that domain of knowledge negates its own assumptions. You just can't do that. You have to either give up your assumptions or change your knowledge, change your domain of knowledge, right? So coming back to the quote, and I'll end on that. So, Donald Hoffman, where are you? Do I have reliable cognitive faculties to find Donald Hoffman? Hopefully. Too many papers. There you go. So Hoffman, Singh, and I think it's Mike. So Hoffman, Singh, and Mark, they basically say the key point is that fitness is distinct from truth. Organisms that evolve fitter vision systems through natural selection need not, ipso facto evolved to see truth. If a true perception takes more time or energy to compute, or if it represents aspects of the world that are irrelevant for guiding adaptive behaviors of the organism, then it could adversely affect fitness. The studies thus far, using evolutionary game theory and genetic algorithms, indicate that true perceptions are not necessarily fitter, and that a simple interface strategy can drive true perceptions to extinction. That's basically the summary of the paper, that the research that I studied by Donald Hoffman and others. So to conclude, from a kind of spiritual perspective, this discussion for especially the Islamic tradition for the Muslims is not kind of abstract, because it has meaning, because we believe our purpose of life, or the meaning of life, is to worship the divine. And worshipping the divine means to know the divine, to love the divine, to obey the divine, and that also includes being humbled before him. And it also includes singling out the internal and external acts of worship to the divine alone. The internal acts of worship is like love and reliance, and external acts of worship is the kind of physical acts of worship, like maybe supplication, prayer, and charity. But those have internal dimensions too, because of intention, etc. But that's a different discussion. So our purpose of life, our meaningful life, is to worship the divine, and that's what we believe gives us a sense of contentment and a sense of fulfillment, because the famous Quranic statement that basically says, if you forget God, God will make you forget your own self, as if our kind of self-identity is contingent on our relationship with the divine, the one that created us. So how does this make sense with worshipping the divine? Well, if you think about it, if we were given reliable cognitive faculties that could produce true beliefs by the divine, then the human mind is a product of the divine. And yet we praise the human mind all the time. Amazing poetry, architecture, quantum theory, cognitive science, all of these amazing things. We go, wow, bravo, it's amazing. We give it a standing ovation, we clap, we applaud. But now given what I said, say it's true. Well, what does it mean how we must now applaud the divine and give extensive praise to the divine? And obviously in the Islamic tradition, praise is a key to worship. So that's how it all links together. So these are interesting ideas that we could explore. And there's so much more to it than that, because this also could relate to the fact that, maybe we won't adopt a Darwinian mechanism to explain our reliable cognitive faculties that can produce true beliefs. Let's adopt another metaphysic, right? Or let's adopt a particular philosophy of the mind, like physicalism. Not just physicalism, but a particular conception of physicalism, like emergent materialism. Now, I didn't want to introduce that now, because that could open a huge can of worms, which we could do later, right? But there's other ways of dealing with it as well from a naturalistic perspective. I don't want to build a straw man thinking, here you go, theism has won the day. That's not my approach here today in any shape or form. So I just want to throw these ideas out there. So just to conclude, the Darwinian mechanism by natural selection, in my view, doesn't really explain the assumption that we've come here today, which is that we all have reliable cognitive faculties that can produce true beliefs, based on what we've discussed. I think an interesting way of looking at it is, well, if you have the first principle, or the metaphysic that the divine exists, it makes sense of this assumption. And if that's the case, then we should not only praise the products of the human mind and praise the human mind, but praise the one who actually created the human mind, which is a form of worship. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
So that concludes the opening statements. We'll now give time for both of our speakers to have a bit of a discussion. Maybe I'll introduce a little bit of my own bias and try to maybe steer the conversation a little bit. But both of you kind of talked about maybe the limitations of logic. And the quote from Hoffman that you mentioned kind of talks about the limitations of Darwinism affecting our ability to develop enhanced logic. And you talked yourself about the limitations of logic and rationality. So how then do we ground our beliefs, or how do you present to people how we would ground our beliefs in a consistent, logical way? Or do beliefs need to be grounded in a logical way? When you talk about wisdom, for instance, I don't pick on you, but I've heard me talk a lot. I haven't heard you talk enough.
That's fine. I don't like being picked on. It's good.
Yeah. But when you talk about that the concept of wisdom, is that logical enough to be considered like an objective truth?
Okay. Well, so I want to respond to both that and first of all, and what Hamza had to say. First of all, I want to compliment Hamza. That was a very philosophically sophisticated argument, and it has he's putting pieces together in an interesting, novel way. I'm not going to talk about the theism conclusion, or at least immediately. We want to come back to that. That's possible. I want to address the issue because and then that will allow me to actually address your questions. So I'm going to try and do the two at the same time. I want to remind you that I don't equate rationality with logicality. And let me try and explain a bit more, because I think the issue here, at least part of what I see Hamza saying is and this is an important difficulty for naturalism in general, which is an issue of normativity, and so they're invoking the normativity of truth. If we have reliability because Hoffman doesn't deny that we have reliability for other things, it's just for the normativity of truth. So that's where the argument bites, and that's fair enough. Here's my response. It's interesting because I've already sort of been independently responding to Hoffman in certain ways. So the problem with the idea that we would have evolved to pursue truth is that would be bioeconomically expensive. As you said, we just don't have the resources. It would consume most of our cognitive processing. I think the thing I would say first in response to that is that's true for everything you try to do. If you try to play a game of chess and you try to, as I said when I was doing the probability, if you try to do all the calculations, that would overwhelm your computational resources. I don't think we evolved for truth. I think we evolved for adaptivity. Again, that's agreed upon. So here's what I want to say, that we don't operate according to one normativity, the normativity of truth. Well, a lot of my work is that there is another normativity that is just as important, that seriously limits the truth we pursue, which is relevance. We only pursue relevant information and truths that are relevant to us, precisely because we have adapted not to seek all possible truths, not to derive all possible implications. You're not deriving all the logical possible implications of every statement I'm making here. If you tried to do it for even one of my statements, it would overwhelm you. So what you're doing consistently, reliably, is zeroing in out of all the possible implications, the ones that you consider most relevant. That's what I meant earlier about your adaptivity. Now here's where I think the argument changes. Once you say that we're arguing that we have evolved to seek relevant truths, and their relevance is precisely because of bioeconomic constraint, then it is no contradiction to say that we evolved to have reliable mechanisms for finding relevant truths. And as I then admitted, that explains both our capacity to find truths that we find relevant, and the fact, right, because a good Darwinian to explain both the successes and the failures, appendus, thumb, and all that sort of thing, right? It also explains why so much of your cognition is very self-deceptive. Now, Hamza did not make this mistake, and I'm not attributing it to him. I just want to say this clarity. Saying that we have reliable mechanisms, we have an assumption of a reliable truth, does not quantify how many truths you have. Doesn't mean you have a lot. Doesn't have to mean you have a lot. We all assume we have a lot, and here's the thing. Empirically, that's false. So if you're trying to rely on the assumption, it's got to be like Hamza said, it has to be a transcendental assumption about the capacity, not your individual cognition, because most of your beliefs and most of my beliefs are false. That is a very reliable result. Okay? So what if all we have to have are what all the argument requires is a finite set of true beliefs, and that's already limited by the normativity of relevance realization? That's how I would respond to that. And now that brings me to this issue of wisdom, because wisdom, like understanding, is not the same thing as knowledge. Like, knowledge is being able to ascertain the truth of your propositions, if we're doing propositional knowledge. Understanding is being able to grasp the significance, the relevance of that knowledge. And it is very possible to have the first without having the second. And insofar as you are committed to a normativity of wisdom, as opposed to just knowledge, and notice that they're different, because knowledge is about overcoming ignorance, but wisdom is about overcoming foolishness, and ignorance and foolishness are not identical. Therefore, knowledge and wisdom are not identical. And insofar as you have a normativity of wisdom, that's one way I'm showing you that you have a normativity of relevance, not just a normativity of truth pursuit. So, now, what does that mean? First of all, I'm not here to try and trespass on the argument about the divine. There's important ways in which I think that's a conversation I would like to enter into. I talk a lot about the importance of the experience of sacredness. So that is not the intent of what I'm doing here. But what I'm trying to show is, I'm trying to show to you, I hope you take this in good spirit, friendliness, that I think it's possible to be a naturalist and respond to the normativity argument by showing that intelligence, and especially understanding and rationality, are not governed just by the normativity of truth, but governed precisely by the normativity of relevance, which is constituted by the very bioeconomic limitations. That's what my work, in fact, tries to argue and show. Constituted by the very bioeconomic limitations that are central to Hoffman and other people's argument. So in that case, I think it's possible. Now, what it does is it does two things. It again means that we have to open up the notion of rationality. And again, I'm trying to suggest that to you, that rationality is not, look, a wise person doesn't just get truth in a situation. The wise person has the more important skill of zeroing in on what's most relevant. That's why insight is such a central feature of wisdom, as opposed to inference. They can zero in on the relevant information when the less wise amongst us struggle. So I think, if you'll allow me, I think it's that we didn't evolve to generate theory. We evolved to cultivate wisdom. And then along the way, that gives us some skills of rationality for overcoming self-deception. And then we have used that, and not everything that we used evolved for that use. I know you're not saying that, that's clearly false. Right? Because lots of stuff, like you can do lots of things that you didn't evolve to do. Right? Like you wear clothes, you didn't evolve to wear clothes. Right? Okay, so the point there, what I'm trying to make is, if you say we evolved for like intelligence and then rationality and wisdom, in which relevance realization is being recursively improved throughout that continuum, then I think that's how I can respond to that. And now, how does that ground it? Because wisdom isn't just about your beliefs. It's not just about your propositional knowledge. Most of what makes you a cognitive agent is not your beliefs. Most of your behavior is not driven by your beliefs. When you came into this room, you're relying on your skills, your navigational skills. And these are the things that's very hard. You know, it's really easy to give to a computer inferential manipulation. You know what's really hard to give to a computer? The ability to walk into this room and sit successfully on the chair. All that know-how. Propositions are knowing that something is the case, knowing that it's true or false, knowing that a cat is a mouse. But that's very different from knowing how to catch a ball, knowing how to kiss your beloved. Skills aren't true or false. They're not governed by a normativity of true or falseness. They're governed by a normativity of aptness. How well do they apply to the situation? So wisdom is not just about getting true beliefs, it's about having apt skills. Your perspectives. You have a normativity there. How do I know about this? Because it comes out in the work we do in virtual worlds. You know what people care about? The sense of presence. That sense of presence is the normativity of your perspectival knowing. The feeling of being connected in the right way. That's not a belief. It's not a belief. That's a way in which you inhabit you know what? You're watching a video game and you don't feel like you're there. Why do I know this is so crucial? Because I'm studying how scientists on Earth move the rovers around on Mars. And you know what they work for? They work for getting that sense of being on Mars. Because that ability to have that perspectival knowing then allows them to cultivate all the skills they need, and then on the basis of the presence and the aptness of their skills, then they can do the science of trying to figure out the true beliefs about Mars. What grounds the true beliefs are the powerful procedures that are then grounded in the situational awareness given by our perspective taking, which is ultimately grounded by the identities we're assuming in our bioeconomic constraints. So that's how you ground it. You don't try and ground it extra theoretically. You try and ground it by saying, and so this is what embodied cognitive science means. No, how you ground it, and this is what I think Hamza's pointed, you ground it in how do people actually do the science? That's what grounds it. What grounds it is, there's nothing in the propositional system that will ground it. I just accept that, right? But I think it's grounded in, right, the propositional is grounded in the procedural, which is grounded in the perspectival, which is grounded in the participatory. And like I say, that gives you a nesting of normativities. Truth for propositions, aptness for skills, presence for perspective, and for participation, that fundamental adaptive fittedness. Because if you're not fitted to your environment, whether or not it's true or false, all this other stuff isn't going to be possible for you. That's what we seem to be showing, like I said in this case study, when you put human beings into a completely novel environment, which is a great test case, because then you get to see what's it like when human beings are in a completely novel environment, because you can watch them trying to build the science literally from the bottom up. And that's how I think you ground the science. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Professor.
Let's call me John.
John. Sorry. Thank you. So that was very interesting. I'm not going to pretend that I understood everything you said. We're going to explore more throughout the question and answers. The thing about relevant truths, I think it could be the case as well that we could have evolved to have what I want to call now relevant falsehoods, right? Which means that it could be...
That's good.
Exactly. So I don't see that as maybe an adequate response to save the naturalistic program. Because James Sage, he makes a really good point. I'd like to read it to you.
Sure.
He talks about basically that, unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs could have led to our survival, because we could have had cautious belief-forming processes that were false. For example, he says, an organism may hide because it believes falsely that a predator is nearby. Evolutionarily, it pays to have cautious belief-forming processes that over-detect dangerous predators, especially when false beliefs carry little cost. So when you talk about relevant truths, are you changing the meaning of truths here? Are you saying it's information or data or an attempt to understand reality that is fitness enhancing, or it is the case that it is a representation of the actual state of affairs?
So let me try to show you what I mean. I think the point you didn't seem to be challenging me. It's not saying the reliabilism argument is not saying we have lots of true beliefs.
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm saying is relevant when you're obtaining relevant information, to use the neutral term you proposed. I'm happy to do with that. It's going to be the case that a lot of that's going to be false beliefs. I'm trying to show that a lot of this isn't even going to be beliefs. It's going to be apt skills, all that stuff. So there's a lot of stuff in here, and then some of that is going to be true. And here's how I respond to that argument. That argument is a signal detection argument, right? It goes like this, right? So signal is information that is relevant to you adaptively, right? This is signal detection theory. Noise doesn't mean auditory noise, although it can be. This means information that's irrelevant to your survival. Is that okay?
Yep.
And so the argument that's being, and here's why I want to challenge the argument. So what we have to do is we have this. So let me give you an example, and it's the cautious one. Okay, so you're a gazelle, and there's a noise in the bush, and you need to know, is it a leopard? Because that's really bad, right? Or is it the wind? Now the problem that's facing you is the information's ambiguous, right? And so what you have to do what's called setting the criteria, right? So this is what I do is I set it here, which means I'm going to treat most noise as a signal, and I run away, and a lot of the times when I'm running away, there's no leopard, and that's a false belief. But it's adaptive, and here's why it's adaptive, because getting eaten by a leopard is way worse than running around a lot, because all that happens is the other gazelle's laughing, right? Now, the problem with in the presupposition of the quote is that that's always the case. But there's two types of errors. There's a miss, right, where you miss a signal that's there, or a mistake, right, where you take noise to be a signal when it isn't. Now, depending on the problem, sometimes this is more risky to you, but on other problems, this is more risky. There is no set place to set the criterion. Now, sometimes, as she points out, it might be good to set the criterion. She proposes very cautious. Set the criterion very high, because the misses are very expensive. But when the mistakes are very expensive, the exact same theory says you have to set the criterion very low. And then what you get is you're going to increase a lot of the truths that you're going to find. I just disagree with the assertion in there that you could be sort of comprehensively adaptive by having a permanently low set criterion.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So I actually totally agree with that. I don't think that's the main issue with the kind of challenge to evolutionary reliabilism per se. It's just basically saying that, well, can we trace back our evolutionary history to show that natural selection, it was more likely that natural selection selected reliable cognitive faculties that produce relevant true beliefs over unreliable cognitive faculties that produce relevant false beliefs. Relevant in this case that they were adaptive, they were fitness enhancing. Right. That would be the problem. So all of this, for me, is great. I think it supports the kind of essence of the argument, and it basically says that we, generally speaking, if we're going to conclude anything, we'll have to be quite skeptical about many of our beliefs. But if we're to say that, yes, we adopt Darwinism as the mechanism to explain what makes us human, that's my point. So the reason I want to be authentic with you, because you are not a neo-atheist, of course, for sure.
I'm not an atheist.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm not an anti-theist.
Absolutely. So the reason why I think this is a very good discussion, because this is like a challenge to the Dawkins of the world, that they have like knowledge claims about religious beliefs, and they point the finger, and they're like, almost absolutist and evangelical about these ideas. And so are religious people too. Right. So there's those swings both ways. I do appreciate that. But this, given the fact that they do adopt the Darwinian mechanism, sometimes in a non-scientific way, because they make it into this kind of, popular...
That I think is reprehensible, yes, I agree.
Yes, absolutely. So the reason I try to develop the strategy to show them, well, if you're consistent with your...
But I like this, because then we don't interrupt each other.
Yeah,
it's like the conscience and Lord of the Flies.
So the argument here is if they're consistent with the propositions and the beliefs about certain things, the fact that the Darwinian mechanism explains, what makes us human, in this case, are reliable cognitive faculties that produce true beliefs, then the logical implication is that they have to adopt a form of skepticism, in my view, right? I don't agree with Stitch and Plantinga, especially Plantinga, who's the kind of the Christian philosopher that says, oh, this refutes, naturalism totally. I think they go too far.
Yeah.
The balanced view would be, I think, at least they should be logically consistent with their perspectives and say, well, we have to be skeptics, like in the true sense that there is no knowledge, and therefore that dampens the pointing of the finger at religious claims and stuff like that. And that's why what I get from you as well when you talk about wisdom is, well, it's about how you relate. Since your state of being is very important. Like there's so many propositions that you could know to be true, but it doesn't necessarily change how you are. Like actually, from you, our discussion last year was phenomenal for me, because I remembered a few things. Number one, you said to the audience, and you're an educator, and that's the educators do that, and it was very profound. You said that in wisdom traditions, you can't be an autodidact.
That's right.
Yes. You need someone to take you through and help you navigate the space.
That's why I introduced that whole aspirational aspect of wisdom is crucial.
Good. I love that. Because that echoes our tradition true, and it shows a lot, because a lot of Muslims who aspire to be like, scholars or intellectuals, if they learn just from the books, you could see it in the way they relate to themselves and other people, right? And I would argue, I don't like using this word, but fundamentalism and extremism is as a result of a lot of autodidacts, because they don't have someone that navigates that wisdom tradition. So I love that. The other thing I got from you was, which I think was amazing, it was that your beliefs are not good predictors for your behaviors.
Yes.
Yeah, which is good. I'm going to come to one of your classes. So the other thing was, which I think was very important, which relates to the Islamic tradition as well, which was that, having information in an abstract way, there is a gap between what you know in kind of abstract information and who you become. So this is why, for me, when I talk about the Islamic tradition, I usually say that Islam is not a belief, because the belief in a philosophical sense can be very mundane, like this is a microphone. But rather, Islam or wisdom traditions, they are forms of knowing that transform what's here, let's call it the spiritual heart if you like, transform what you say and how you relate to yourself and how you relate to others. Now, that shift in your state of being doesn't come through reading a book, understanding propositions, logic.
That's right.
Yeah, it comes through. Actually, why don't you tell us? So you tell us.
Yeah. This is pretty deep.
What it comes through?
How do you change your state of being?
Well, first of all, I want to say something one of the things that Socrates was on about was exactly, he died for relevant truths. He rejected the sophists who just manipulated the relevance and the salience of information, but he also rejected the natural philosophers of the day because although they could provide truths, those truths were in no way transformative. He rejects both because he said that what we actually need in order to become good and wise are relevant truths. So that's what and why does that come up? Because you can ask, well, when the Socratic tradition was a tradition, I think, that was directed to the very question you're asking. How do we go about changing who we are fundamentally? And that's a very interesting thing because, like I said, and you seem to be agreeing with it, you can't infer your way through it. I want to give you an example of this from the work of L.A. Paul about transformation. She does a thought experiment, and we're using lots of thought experiments here, so I think that's legit for a discussion. She says, I've already given you just an idea of what the perspectival and participatory knowing is, but I'll bring it out in this example as well. She says, your friends come to you and they give you really convincing evidence that they can do the following. Now, this is pretty close to Halloween, so this is okay. They say, we can turn you into a vampire. You say, so here's the question, should you do it? Well, here's the problem. You don't know what it's going to be like to be a vampire. You don't know until you become, but once you become it, then you're lost, because then you can't get back. Right? And you also don't know who you're going to be when you're a vampire. So there's going to be a change in your perspectival knowing, and there's going to be a change in your identity, because your preferences and values are going to be shifted, because you're going to be vampiric rather than you. So you don't know the values you're going to have, and you don't know the perspective, you don't, right? So how do you decide? Because if you don't do it, you literally don't know what you're missing. And if you do it, you literally don't know what you're going to lose. And you say, oh, what? So what? Here's her point, because when she gave her the thought experiment, she says, this is the decision you face, right, whenever you're considering some kind of fundamental transformation. Are you going to have a child? You don't know what it's, you want to know what's going to change you? Have a child. You're going to be different, right? And you're about, like, well, I won't have a child because I don't want to be that other person. But you don't know what you're missing. If you do it, right here, your friends will tell you stuff that you don't know because you don't know what it's going to be like for you and who you're going to be once you have a child. Enter into a romantic relationship with someone. You know what's going to change you? Being in that romantic, you're going to be a different person, and it's going to be what it's going to be like to be you is going to be different after you enter. So you can't infer your way through it because you can't use decision theory because you don't have a stable set of probabilities, you don't have a stable set of utilities, you don't have a stable set of anything. And yet, almost all the important things we do, like the aspiration to wisdom, like the aspiration to rationality, require that transformation. Like, why did you come to school? Well, I want to become a different person than I am. But you don't know what you're going to be losing. You don't know what you're going to be missing if you don't come to school. So how do we go through it? Well, here's something that I think would be very welcome in your tradition. The way we do it is we do it by a form of symbolic play. Now, don't mishear my word play. I want you to hear it the way it's used in developmental psychology, not the way our culture has trivialized it to the pursuit of fun. I want you to hear serious play. It survives when we say things like playing music. I do Tai Chi Chuan. You don't do Tai Chi in the Chinese language, you play it. And it doesn't mean I'm doing something frivolous or for fun. I'm doing something really serious, but nevertheless, it's called play. Why? Now think about it. Let's go back to whether or not you're going to have a child. What do people do? Well, I sort of wondered this, and I got to talk to L.A. Paul directly. I said, well, and so I proposed an answer. She said, well, yeah, I think so. This is what I see people doing. They go out and get a dog. And then they do really kind of creepy things with the dog. They take pictures with the dog, and they put it in a bed, and they take it on vacations. Whoa, that's kind of weird. Or the advice that your friends might give you when you're considering getting into a relationship. They'll say, go on a trip with that person. Travel with them. What are they doing? Well, what they're doing is they're creating not a thought analog. They're creating an enacted analog where they put you in this place. Because what play does is it puts you in this place where you're getting enough of the, if you'll allow me this word, the taste of the world you want to get into, and the taste of the person you might be, but you haven't fully committed, right? And then you still can withdraw here. And so what people do is they symbolically play, they enact. And it's becoming really profound that people who I would think would describe themselves as secular, in very secular countries, undertake this kind of thing. Let me give you an example. The Nordic countries, some of the most secular countries in the world, right? And then also some of the best places to live, according to sort of a Steven Pinker graph. I don't think he's right, but that's another thing. Okay, so what's becoming very popular there is a thing called Jeep form. So this is live action role playing. You go into a role playing situation, and instead of a dungeon master, there's a person who's a director, and they'll assign you, you're going to play the husband, and you're going to play the wife, and you've just discovered that she's unfaithful, and you're going to act this out. Now what the director is doing is changing roles around, giving you props, trying to get you into a jazz state of mind, because they're after this phenomena, bleed. What they want is that as you're playing this, the distinction between the play and what's happening in your real life, the line bleeds, so that the play gets infected by what is happening in your real life, so that you can do that tasting of how it might other be without yet having fully committed to it. I'm just trying to give you this example, that this is how human beings actually move in the way, because they can't do it inferentially. They seriously, symbolically, inactively play themselves. Now, I happen to think, and I mean this respectfully, I happen to think that a lot of sacred practice is serious play in that sense. That a lot of what goes on in what people, and again, I mean this respectfully, if you watch any of my videos, you know I was respectful of religious traditions. Right? But I think what's going on in worship, what I think is going on in the law, for me, Tai Chi Chuan comes out of a spiritual tradition. I think that is that very kind of sacred play. I think there are a lot of, I'm not claiming all, I'm not trying to trespass on your theism, but I think a lot of the functionality of religion is the indispensable serious play that allows us to grow the wisdom and the rationality that we cannot infer our way into. That's how I think we do it.
So interesting.
Actually, like, just to play off of that is that
Nice point.
like the Hajj rituals, the pilgrimage that we do, a lot of it, like you said, is completely symbolic, and it's meant to mimic what each person will do on the Day of Judgment. So the fact that you're crammed with so many different people in one location, because when we're resurrected, we're crammed in one location. All the men are wearing 2 pieces of shawl, just like the 2 pieces of shawl the shrouds that we bury our dead in. So it's as if you've been resurrected from the grave, and you've got your shroud on, and you're crammed in the one location, and you're all begging God for mercy, just like you would be.
Right.
So it's just that same idea. It's like it's being a play, and it's trying to prepare you spiritually for something that will happen.
I think what's very interesting with this is, I wasn't always Muslim. I became Muslim around 16 years ago, and I remember, just reading about the Islamic tradition and being like, inverted commas, right, intellectually convinced it's a God, He's one, X, Y, and Z. I think what was very important for me is I learned how to pray, the 5 daily prayers, before I became Muslim. And in a way, it was that kind of play, in a respectful sense, right?
Yeah.
And that created an awakening within me. So in the Islamic tradition, and this, can correlate to studies in the psychology of religion, in cognitive science, fine, they're not conclusive, but there's something there, where every human being has this natural state, this innate disposition. Within this innate disposition is a form of proto-knowledge, right, primary knowledge. In the Islamic tradition, we argue it is the knowledge that God is a reality and that He is worthy of extensive praise. Now, and there's other things like beauty, basic morality, but let's focus on the 2 essential elements here, which is that God is a reality and He's worthy of extensive praise. Now, what happens to the innate disposition, which is called the Vitro in Islam, based on various prophetic traditions, is that it gets clouded, right? It gets clouded because of parenting, like parents corrupt their children, right? Yeah. And society does. You have systemic effects for sure. If you've seen the Joker, you'll understand them, right? So it gets clouded. So what happens is that there are different things that can uncloud the innate disposition to awaken the truth within. So to change the state of being from the Islamic point of view is that thing which unclouds the innate disposition to awaken that truth within. And for many people, it could be different things. It could be trauma. Like trauma, like, in psychology, they talk about, the way to get transformation is through trauma or insights. Insight is very difficult, right? Trauma is easy because life's going to kick you in the mouth and it's going to be dark and you look for your teeth, yeah? So that's what life's going to do, and that's when there's a death in the family, or an illness, or humiliation, or failure. These are sometimes blessings, and I don't mean that by belittling anyone's suffering, by the way, but they could be blessings when you look back. You say, oh my God, that creates such an awakening for me, or a transformation in my state of being, meaning the way I relate to myself and other people. So from the Islamic paradigm point of view, maybe it wasn't the intellectual stuff 16 years ago that basically made me take that leap, if you like, or that transformation. It was actually through the practice. And I remember my friend telling me that, in the Islamic tradition, the closest you are to your Lord is in prostration, because the face is like the symbol of the ego, and God is almighty, He's high, He's perfect, with the most perfect names and attributes. He's maximally perfect, and His names and attributes have no deficiency or flaw. Human beings, in contrast, are nothing. There is not even a comparison. And that whole process of you worshipping the divine is basically, it was an awakening thing for me. So that's interesting, because for me, that created that type of an awakening for me to, maybe have a realization that for me, Islam was the way of life to follow. So this is all interesting stuff, man. Have you tried Qigong?
Oh yeah, I've been doing Qigong for decades.
Have you done hard Qigong?
I've done Iron Shirt, which
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've done Iron Shirt.
Okay, good. I have a question for you, right? So
I'm not an expert in Iron Shirt.
For sure. I used to do something called steel wire mantis, right? So steel wire mantis was, you'd have the northern and southern style of mantis, but they added steel wire because they incorporate Qigong.
Mm-hmm.
And Qigong, you have the soft side and the hard side.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember in one of my Qigong classes, you have the dantian, which is about 1 inch down, 2 inches in, and you get this kind of magnetic thing going on. I think this all could be explained naturalistically for sure.
I have a paper coming out on a naturalistic explanation.
I want to see that, because I've been dying. I tell you why. Because I horse kicked someone in the stomach and they didn't budge. You didn't hurt them. You know what horse kick is, right?
Yeah.
It was designed to kick horses, to take people off a horse and harm the horse, right? So I'm a heavy guy. I was like 90 kilos plus at that time, I think, yeah? And I horse kicked him and he was like, as if nothing happened, right?
Yeah.
How can you just, I know your paper's coming out, can you explain to everybody how on earth that works? And that's just for me, because I've been in the martial art traditions since the age of 12 or something, and I really want to know, how does hard Qigong work?
Well, I don't know about hard Qigong. I mean, I can tell you, so...
Like I said, I'm not an expert in that. And so the paper isn't on that specifically.
Just ask me to hold the mic down.
Hold the mic down? Thank you. It isn't about that specifically. It's about just a naturalistic explanation of the Qi phenomena.
Yes.
So like the things I'm interested in explaining are things like the 1 inch punch. How people can be one inch away and inflect it. So, and I sometimes do that on my students and things like that. And so when you measure that, putting all the mystique aside, and mystique is not the same thing as mysticism, but putting all the mystique aside, when we study it, people that are highly trained in this can get up to 70% of a full body piston punch in a 1 inch punch. So it's not made up BS. It's a real thing. And then, well, how are they doing that? And so, it's not an easy explanation, because if it was an easy explanation, human beings would have come upon it by now. So, first of all, and this is also work I've published on, do you guys know about the flow state? How many of you have heard of the flow state, getting into the zone? Athletes get into it, you get into it when you're sparring. It explains an otherwise bizarre phenomenon, rock climbing. Rock climbing sounds like something from Greek punishment, in ancient Greek mythology. You're going to climb up that rock face. It's going to hurt. You might fall to your death. And then once you get to the top, come back down. But why do human beings do it? Because it seems absolutely stupid from, right, sort of a hedonistic. They do it because it puts them into the flow state. So what is it like to be in the flow state? When you're in the zone, you feel it's optimal in two ways. First of all, people reliably, this is why they do the rock climbing, they reliably report this is one of the best experiences they have in their life. Have any of you ever had this, maybe dancing or fencing, anything like that? Some people? Sparring. You can get it playing jazz. I bet you didn't realize you were in it. How many of you have gotten into sort of the zone video gaming? Anybody? Because that's a reliable way of getting people into the flow state as well. Okay, so it's optimal in that people really like it, but it's also optimal in another way. People are at their very best. So when an athlete is you know what, you can see that moment. And athletes are constantly, like Jamie Wheels stealing fire and some of the work I do, they're constantly trying to get into the flow state. You can see when an athlete gets into the flow state. Because what happens is, although you can tell metabolically they're putting in all kinds of effort, it seems effortless. It seems like, and when I get into the flow state, it's like, I can tell that my body is expending lots of energy, but it feels effortless. It's graceful. And go back to the original meaning of grace, gifted. Right? It's like suddenly something happens. Now, athletes and martial artists and jazz musicians and the top-notch video gamers try to get into the flow state precisely because that's when they're performing at their best. Because what you're doing in the flow state is you're basically getting you're getting your body and your mind to do a whole cascade of insight problem. It's like you're chaining a whole bunch of aha moments together, and you're really ramping up your intuitive ability to pick up on complex patterns. So, if you can get into the flow state, and that's what Taoism is, and that's what Tai Chi and Qigong are, like they're techniques, practices for reliably getting into the flow state. Now, if you get into the flow state, what happens? Well, you lose all this narrative stuff. You get the sense of time is now passing very differently. You have a tremendous, and this is why here's how predictive you find. And again, no lack of respect, but irrespective of your religious affiliation, how often you get into the flow state is predictive of how meaningful you will rate your life. It's an antidepressant, not a drug, but the more often you get in the flow state, the much less likely you are to become clinically depressed. Okay, so it's really, and here's the other thing, it's universal. Across cultures, religion, socioeconomic groups, genders, professional levels, people can get into the flow state and they describe it almost identically. So that means it's very fundamental to how your cognition works. So, right? So it's optimizing your cognition, it's optimizing your connectivity, it's optimizing your performance. And if you get to, so remember I said you're playing Tai Chi? Imagine doing jazz, but not with an instrument, but with your body, so that you have that hyper-coordination mixed with innovation at all times, like a jazz musician. A jazz musician has to be terrifically proficient in playing. You can't just fake it. You have to be really, really proficient first, but also, to be good jazz, you also are constantly innovative. So if you're in a flow state, you're high proficiency, high innovation, and you're embodying that in a kind of hyper-coordination in your body. And that's where the power comes from. There's what you find is that all of the muscles, not just the large piston muscles, the small control muscles, the feedback loop from the nervous system to the brain, the feedback loop within the brain between the cerebellum and the frontal cortex, these are all being optimized sufficient. And then when somebody hits you with Qi, you feel it. Because all of these muscles, all of these processes have been hyper-coordinated. That's what Qi is.
Thank you.
I don't know what it has to do with the rest of what we're talking about.
I think it's time to open up for Q&A, although that was great because you basically told everyone if you don't have khushu'ah, you're going to get depressed. So, khushu'ah is our term for basically being in that zone while you're praying.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, I guess we'll just raise your hand.
You can have the microphone.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I guess this question for both of you. And sorry,
Babe, do we have another mic to pass to the people in the audience, or?
It's a small question to be honest, but
But it would be good if both the recording and the audience could hear the questions.
Just 2 seconds. Can you please define what you mean by truth, and can you also define
because I know you said Hoffman, and then how he kind of discussed the truth. What do you mean by that? Okay.
So the Hoffman study is about true perceptions.
Okay.
So what you perceive is the understanding of what you perceive and a representation of the actual state of affairs, what's out there. So the argument by Hoffman is, well, you could have false perceptions and survive. And it's probably likely that natural selection selected that over true perceptions because false perceptions were conducive to survival and reproduction, which really undermines undermines empiricism, right? If it's true, right, from that point of view. So it's an interesting study. And obviously with most studies, you need more research, right? So that's what, just to clarify your understanding of Hoffman. Now you want to understand what I mean by truth? Oh my God.
Because I mean, the word truth was kind of thrown on a lot, so I just wanted to...
Yeah, I mean, look, truth, there are different, in philosophy, there are different understandings of truth, right? So, coherentism, foundationalism, X, Y, and Z. It's also referred to as, like, for example, when you say something is true, it's a representation of the actual state of affairs. But I'm going to talk about this from an Islamic perspective. So, this is such a loaded question. Well, truth in this case is the representation of the actual state of affairs. But what the actual state of affairs is basically the affirmation that there is the divine and that he is worthy of worship, right? And that would be a truth from a kind of spiritual, metaphysical point of view. But there's also truths like saying that that's a table, right? Me saying that is a table, that proposition or that statement is a representation of the actual state of affairs. So when Muslims say that there is the divine and he is worthy of worship, that for us is a representation of the actual state of affairs because there is a divine and the divine is worthy of worship. And we could articulate why that's the case, but that's a lengthier discussion. But I want to relate this to this kind of false notion that sometimes the Muslim community has. I think we've secularized our knowledge. I don't mean that in an insensitive way, because I agree with the professor on this issue. There is not a button you press and all of a sudden you have this kind of spiritual or existential certainty, if you want to use those terms, yeah? Or a lever you pull. It just doesn't work that way. Because, when we're talking about certainty, let's talk about who is certain. It's the human being. But what is the human being? The human being is not this computerized functional model that you type in an algorithm and all of a sudden that's it. You've got it, right? From an Islamic point of view, you found the divine algorithm for guidance and you type it in and that's it. Just like in the Matrix, now no Kung Fu. It doesn't work that way. So that's why in the Islamic tradition we have certainty as a concept there are grades. There are levels of certainty. That's why from the Quranic discourse point of view you have the notion of Yaqin, which is the certainty of knowing something, that someone's like giving you a report. For example, that you hear a radio report that the hospital's on fire. Then you have Yaqin, which is you've seen the hospital on fire. So it's the certainty of seeing or observing. And then you have Yaqin, which is the certainty of being, because you're relating to the hospital in a way that you're in the hospital and you're experiencing the fire. So these are levels of certainty, and that's why, I could say to you, look, my mother's cooking is the best cooking in the world. It's par excellence, yeah? She makes the best gala do bureko. In Greek, gala do bureko is one of the best sweets. Go get it. It's amazing, yeah? I could have, if I'm on a diet, I'll break my diet. I'm very disciplined sometimes, right? I'll have a whole tray, or almost a whole tray, yeah? So I can describe that to you by saying, this is how she makes it, these are the ingredients. Now that is what you call in Islamic tradition, Yaqin, which is the certainty of knowing something in an abstract way, right? From this perspective. Then you could actually see her doing it, right? See someone tasting it and saying, oh, it's so nice, yeah? That would be in some way, Yaqin, the certainty of observing it. But for you to have the highest form of certainty, you got to eat the stuff, right? So hopefully that helps in some way to unravel that it's not just the simple 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Because once you understand the human being is not just a computerized functional model. The human being in the Islamic tradition is a ruh, is a soul, consciousness, is a nafs, a psychology, is a qalb, a heart, and an aql, and the aql is an intellect. And in the Islamic tradition, the intellect is a function of the spiritual heart. right? And then we also have that innate disposition, the fitra. All of these things are in dynamic interplay. That's why, cognitive science, from what I learned from the professor last year, is that your beliefs, abstract beliefs, are not good predictors for your behaviors, right? So we're complex. There's a lot of things going on, right? So yeah, I didn't answer your question, but anyway.
Got a question here.
Well, I'm going to answer the question too, because he directed it to both
Yeah,
of
of course,
us.
absolutely.
So, the thing that struck me most, and I did all the requisite, philosophy courses in epistemology and theories of truth and all that. And the thing that stuck with me out of all of that was Spinoza. Truth is not something you know, it's something by which you know, which is a very different thing. So, if you try to look for a property in a proposition that makes it true, I think you're looking in the wrong place. So, what I take that to mean is I take truth to be, judgments of truth are one way in which we make judgments of realness, and judgments of realness are always comparative judgments. It's like you can't say something is tall except in comparison to something that's short. You can't say something is real except by having overcome, like, what I'm trying to say is you have to overcome some kind of illusion or self-deception to then make the judgment of truth. I don't think you can make the judgment of truth per se to a proposition. What I'm saying is, there's no way of knowing truth independent of transformation. If I haven't gone through and go, whoa, I'm now in a place from this perspective where I can see how that perspective was limiting, that now allows me comparatively to say, this is more real than that. And insofar as my statements, right, give me beliefs that track that movement, then I would say they're on the track of the truth. So I'm not of the opinion that truth is, right, but I want to point out that we have other judgments of realness independent of our beliefs. Because, as Hamza said, your beliefs, I typically don't ask people what they believe, I typically ask them what they practice.
That's deep.
So think about again the skill, the Tai Chi. Like the realness there isn't truths. In fact, one of the ways I would want, if I was sparring with Hamza, is I'd try to get him into propositional thought. Because if he gets into propositional thought, his skill level goes down and then I can beat the crap out of him. So one of the things you can do is, if you're sparring with somebody, say, hey, that was a really good strike. How did you do that? And then they're doomed. Right? So what I'm trying to show you, realness there is something more like this aptness, like that element of grace, what I was talking about in flow. So we use flow as a measure of sort of the realness of our procedural engagement of the world. That sense of presence, like the scientists are trying to get on Mars. That's how we measure our perspectival realness. And then you know that participatory knowing, the kind of person you're becoming. There's you know in your bones when you're becoming, right, when you're sort of on track in your development, and then when your development is going awry. But often you only know it by going through growth. Think about going through grief. I've lost both parents. Right? You don't know until after. The only way through grief is to grow into another person that can see, right, the person who is in grief. And my friend Chris helped me through some very significant grief. Right? So that's the participatory realness. I'm realizing, listen to the word, who I'm supposed to be. We have all of these different standards of realness. And I think the truth of our propositions cannot be found independent of transformation. And we have all kinds of transformations that are not about transforming our beliefs. So that's what I would say to that. Yeah, that was kind of too much, right?
No.
Hi, first of all, thank you all for the very nice discussion. It was a great exercise. I have two questions. So first, to Dr. Vervaeke, you talked about relevant truths and that how everyone will, since we're adopted and since we evolved to be adopted, we all have our own personal truths that we find relevant. So when you say something like that, does that mean that there is no subjective truth, that each one would have their own different truths from their own different perspective, from their own different relevant truths? And then the second question...
Wait, it would be better for me if I answered each question singularly rather than having both questions. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Is that fair to you?
Yes, I won't forget the question.
Yeah, so please don't.
So you have to be very careful, because the fact that I'm not equating relevance to a subjective judgment, right? Like if you don't do the relevant move in chess, you lose, right? It's not an arbitrary selective preference. So think about let me use the analogy from evolution, right? Fittedness is not a property of the organism. Is the great white shark fit? Well, it depends. If it's in the Atlantic, yes. You drop it in the Sahara, no, it dies. Fittedness is not a property of the environment. It's not a property of the world, like of the physical environment. Fittedness is a real relation between the organism and the environment. It's neither a subjective preference, nor is it an objective physical property, part of the physics of the ontology. It's a real relation between them. Relevance is the cognitive equivalent of that biological fittedness. It's the real relation, and I talked about reality and realness, it's the real relation between you and the environment, that you are appropriately fitted so that your limited finite resources can zero in on the information that is needed in that situation to deal with the realities of that situation. So I'm trying to say, what I'm arguing for is not any kind of subjective realism, subjective relativism at all. I'm arguing for a relational realism, and those are two very, very different things.
Thanks for clarifying. The second question is, I want to know the relationship between the human mind and the heart. So I'm a psychologist.
What's the second thing?
The heart.
The heart.
The human mind and the heart. And this is for both of you. As a psychology student, we learned that, yes, everything's in your brain. You know, it's amygdala, it's everything, nothing's in the heart, it's on the brain. But then when you come from the Islamic perspective, you hear about things like, oh, it's not the eyes that are blind, but it's the hearts that are blind. So there's a lot of kind of symbolism to the heart in Islam. And I want to know, from the cognitive perspective and from the Islamic perspective, how do you rationalize that? Are they two different entities? Is it just a human mind? What is it exactly? And where do our emotions come from? Where does our motivation kind of come from?
Sure. Okay, so, the problem with the word heart is it's ambiguous between two different things. There's the thing that's pumping your blood, and you can lose that. People do. They get artificial hearts. And as far as I can tell, they don't lose the other meaning of heart. So I'm going to talk about the other meaning and not this physical organ. This physical organ is something that is often physiologically felt when we're having particular emotions. But I don't think the physical organ is the relevant thing at all, for the reason I just gave you. And so, what do you mean by the heart? Well, I think you mean a whole bunch of things, like when Pascal talks about, that the heart has reasons that reason knows not of. He's meaning a whole bunch of things together. He's meaning emotion. He's meaning motivation. He's also meaning your what he calls the spirit of finesse, your sense of a situation. Like, when you're going to kiss somebody, he compares it to the spirit of geometry. You don't sort of geometrically calculate how you're going to kiss somebody. Because getting the Pythagorean theorem, that's the right angle, here I go, right? You don't do that because it's not just a matter of the calculation, it's a matter of the right timing, the right placement, the right stage of your development, the right stage of that person's development, and to use a word I just mentioned before, whether or not there's a real relationship between you and that person, all of that has to be taken into account. So, I think that when we're talking about the heart, we're talking about all of those other kinds of knowings, and then the propositional knowing that I've been mentioning, the procedural, because look, all of these kinds of knowings require you zeroing in on, if I'm going to catch a ball, I have to zero in for me, and I also have to care in the right way. I have to be caring and coping moment by moment, to catch a ball. I have to be caring and coping if I'm caring about maintaining my sobriety, maintaining my sanity. And you know what you care way more about than you care about truth? And sorry, you care way more about your sanity than you do about your truth. I'm really confident about that. If I offered you, I'll give you all kinds of truths, but you're going to be friggin' insane when you get them. Yeah, I want that.
right? So you care about your sanity. Notice it's not like you're carrying an emotion around with you all day. Or like, I don't know what it would be, fear or, oh, my sanity. I don't know what it is. But you care about it deeply. See, so caring doesn't necessarily mean feeling either. It means the way in which you are zeroing in on what's relevant, what's important, what you're identifying with, and how much you're committing your time and your attention and your development to it. I think, from a cognitive scientific point of view, that's what the heart is.
Thank you for your question. It's a very deep question that traditionally, in the Orthodox Islamic tradition, there's discussion on it. But see, what I mentioned earlier concerning the qalb, the heart, the aql, which according to many of the scholars, the intellect, the aql is the function of the heart. And what we mean by heart here is the spiritual heart, right? And then you have the nafs, the kind of psychology, you have the ruh, the soul, and you have the fitra. All of these things are at a dynamic interplay. Now, when you want to zoom in on the heart, so as you said, the heart is blind, right? So the heart can become softened, it can become hardened, right? And in Islamic spiritual practice, the whole point of Islamic spirituality, in accordance to the Quran and the prophetic traditions, is to soften one's heart as well. For example, when you engage with, for example, dhikr. Dhikr is the remembrance of the divine.
And that softens the heart.
It's the spiritual heart, not the...
I know.
You get me? So it softens the heart, or in this case, it polishes the heart. Like according to one prophetic tradition, everything has a polish, and the polish of the heart is the dhikr of Allah, is the remembrance of Allah. You can't rationalize that. You have to do it, right? And as you continue the spiritual practice, something happens, right? So the heart can be polished. And that's very interesting, because when it's polished, it can reflect like divine guidance and mercy. Because you know when someone is truly remembering God and they're present with the divine, they don't look like this and angry all the time and want to be aggressive. There's something about them, right? So the heart can be polished. Also, the heart can have blemishes. We call them spiritual blemishes. So, for example, one key blemish of the heart is hatred. The Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, said that hatred is a razor, and it shaves off the religion. Meaning, it shaves off, I'm pondering on this perspective, of course, it shaves off your iman, your faith, right? Your kind of conviction, your spiritual conviction, and your relation with the divine. So, and we have tools on how to deal with hatred. For example, if I hate you, one of the tools in the Islamic spiritual tradition is that I now make dua, I supplicate for him. No one knows that apart from me and Allah, right? And if every night I'm supplicating for this person, what's your name, bro? Nazir. So I'm saying, oh Allah, please guide Nazir, please forgive him, grant him the best in this life and the hereafter, shower him with your boundless love and mercy, grant him and his family the best in this life and the hereafter, and assure that applies to all of their progeny to the day of judgment. That's powerful stuff. You might not mean it here, but you know that through spiritual practice, the blemish of your heart, particularly in this case hatred, will be removed, and it works. This has been going on for like over 1,000 years in our tradition, for 1,400 years. This is our spiritual tradition. So, for example, things like ostentation, right? Showing off, right? Look at me, I'm a philosopher, and I can do a 1-inch punch, and I'm a Wing Chun guy, and all of these things, right? That's like showing off ostentation. So, for example, if you say you want to give sadaqah in the Islamic tradition is charity. All acts of worship must be done for the sake of the divine, not for your ego, right? Because he is worthy of that act by virtue of the fact that he is Al-Ilah, Allah, the deity, the one worthy of worship. He's worthy of your love. And, you want his divine reward, and you prevent yourself from the inevitable consequences of closing the door to divine guidance and mercy, which in the Islamic tradition is the fire. So doing it for all these reasons is sincerity. If you do it for other than that, if you do it for your ego, for praise, that's like a form of ostentation, it's arrogance, right? How do you deal with that now? So in the Islamic spiritual tradition, to deal with that which is in the heart, you do an act of worship outside of the obligatory acts every day that only you and God know. So one of those acts in the spiritual tradition, with the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, he basically said, this person coming to the mosque, he's an inhabitant of paradise. So one of the companions followed him, stayed with him, I think for 3 days. And he didn't see anything. His practice was normal. So he said, how come you're going to paradise, right? eternal bliss, right? Why? How? Kind of thing. And he said, well, every night, before I go to bed, I free my heart from any hatred, right? And that is the deed that no one knows apart from you and God. And doing that continuously creates that state of being, the way you relate to Allah, the way you relate to yourself and others. In this case, the way you relate to Allah, it creates that state of being in which you do these acts of worship for no one else but for the divine, right? So other blemishes of the heart can include jealousy, right? So jealousy in Islamic tradition is not being envious from the point of view that you want that thing as well. That's natural sometimes, right? Oh, he's got a great house. I would like a great house too, right? That's not nasty per se. What is malicious and evil from that point of view is that you want his house. Or you want a house and you don't want him to have a house, right? That would be blameworthy in Islamic tradition. So how do you deal with that? Again, you supplicate for him. You understand who the divine is, because the divine is all powerful. His bounties are infinite. So you now saying that I need to get it and he shouldn't get it, it's like you're diminishing the bounties of God. That God is not powerful enough. He doesn't have the bounties to share and give everybody what they. Do you see my point? So there's so many different things. I'm just paraphrasing, but so the spiritual heart is the thing that also believes, right? And isn't it very interesting? Because you could give two people the same information and they will have the different conclusion. Look at me my whole life. If you look at my life, right? Say my life is this line here. And you see me here, I have the same information, but I'm in a fundamentally different state of being. And I have the same information here, and I'm in a fundamentally different state of being. Why is that the case? Why is that the case that, we have the same abstract information, but we conclude differently, right? Just like evil and suffering in the world. One would conclude, like Arthur Schopenhauer, the pessimist philosopher, we're doomed. Forget it. It's finished, right? And let's just try and justify suicide, right? The greatest act of freedom is killing yourself, because you didn't choose your birth, but you could choose your death, right? It's gloomy, right? Or you could give a different meaning to evil and suffering, right? So the point here is the same kind of reality or data, you could react differently because the way you relate to it in the Islamic tradition is about where your heart is. Do you see? So I know there's a lot here, but there you go.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
I think there was convergence there, because I would say what's changed is the significance of if the information is constant, what's changed is its significance or relevance. Like when you're looking at the duck rabbit or the necker cube, things like that. The information is the same, but its relevance or significance and its understanding for you has changed.
But who's doing the understanding?
Well, but that's the point is, I would say that you're also changed, or the who it's doing the understanding is also changing. What I meant is your explanation of the heart as being what grasps the difference, even though the information is the same, sounded very similar to what I was saying about, I think the relevance realization process is a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about the heart. That's what my answer to her. I also wanted to note that that you invoked the presence of God as a standard of realness, which again goes towards that sense of presence being an important way by which we evaluate the realness of things that's independent and maybe even generative of our capacity for belief. You seem to be arguing that. So I thought that was a point of convergence as well. I just wanted to note that.
Okay, thank you.
Just want to thank the organizers and thank you, Dr. John, for your insights that you shared with us today. I'm going to ask you a question it's a similar question to what I asked you last time when you and Mr. Hamza spoke, and it was around the Quran. I think I asked you last time if you had engaged in it or read it, and I believe you said no. Correct me if I'm wrong. And
at that time, yeah, I hadn't read it, and I have not read very much of it since.
Okay. So it's I guess so. What from the Islamic texts has personally resonated with you, and what questions would you like to explore further? I do have a second question around your beliefs around God, but I'll wait. Thank you.
Go ahead. The first one, I mean, I haven't read a lot of the Quran, and I don't want to pretend that I have. I've just read snippets here and there. I've been reading a lot about Islamic philosophy. I've been especially reading it through the work of Corbin. Corbin was, he was part of the circle of people like Carl Gustav Jung and others. And Corbin was making an argument, he was trying to bridge between Heideggerian phenomenology and Persian philosophy. And he was making a strong argument for the importance that Persia had placed in philosophical history because it acted as a connecting place between European philosophy on one side and Indian, Southern Asian philosophy on the other. And so I've been reading a lot of that, and I've been very, and so I've been also reading. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name because I would mispronounce it. But he was a Persian philosopher and mystic, and he wrote I believe the English translation is something like The Way of Illumination. And why I'm particularly interested in it is he talks about knowing by presence, something that has been invoked here and something that I've been arguing. And and so the idea of illumination is not to primarily develop more and more sophisticated chains of belief, but to being about the transformation of consciousness and cognition, so you get an increasing sense of the realness of things in terms of how they are present, because you have that sense of presence. And so I found that particularly wow, because that really jives with a lot of the cog sci that I'm doing right now, and I found that really, really insightful. And then Corbin is talking about people like that and referring to them because Corbin is introducing this term which he calls the imaginal. The imaginary is the mental images you have in your head, right? And then we have sort of the formal patterns of reality. The imaginal are the patterns between us and the world. Let me try and give you an example. What's an example of the imaginal as opposed to the imaginary? Suppose let's say here's something we care about: justice. I want you to hold justice in your mind. I want you to make justice present in your mind. What do? Justice. No. So what many people do, because I do this all the time, is they'll imagine the woman with the scales, with the balance. And why? It's weird. Well, because when balance is actually what you, like when I'm moving around and I'm balancing, I'm actually using the cerebellum, right? It's actually giving my balance. But what I can do by having this symbol, right, of justice, I can hold justice in my mind by picturing the lady with the scales. I can then activate my balance machinery, and then I can feel what it's like to be balancing things. And that part of the cerebellum that you use when you're physically balancing, you also use it when you're trying to balance complex abstract relations between people and systems. You're using the same cognitive machinery. So you're enacting a symbol that engages. You don't just think about justice, you don't just picture it, you're enacting justice, you're embodying it, you're making it happen in you. That's the imaginal. And that's how you're making justice present. There's a deep connection between knowing by presence and, again, this symbolic, serious play. And that's having a deep influence on my thought right now.
Thank you, sir. So, second part of my question was about God, because this lecture is entitled God, and I did feel like last time you were hesitant to.
I'm always hesitant to talk about God.
So that's exactly my question, because you said some beautiful things, sir, about our cognitive abilities, and you were very certain about them, and you really phrased them quite nicely.
I don't know. I'm certain. I think that's too strong, but okay. I think they're plausible.
I even know that, and I know you've had discussions with Dr. Jordan Peterson as well too.
Yep.
Some have recently had discussions. I'm not saying anything negative or positive about him. Some have had discussions about him that he's also quite long-winded, or prefaces, has this long discussion. He doesn't want to state which group of people he belongs to, or perhaps doesn't want to be affiliated with a label. But I feel that has, respectfully, I feel that hesitancy from yourself, and I would like to know why that is. If it's possible, I don't want to assume your background. I know that you teach courses on Buddhism, but why is there this hesitancy to say, okay, there is a God, there is a divine reality?
Okay, well, I'm going to answer your question from the way it's framed it. I'm not going to try and answer the question about I'm not going to try and establish to you whether God exists or not. I think that's pretentious on my part. So that, I don't think, I'm going to answer the question the way you framed it. Why is there hesitancy on my part? Okay, is that fair enough?
No.
Well, can I answer that first, and then you can come back, okay? But I think, well, let me try first, because it might go towards why you're still suspicious. First of all, I agree with you that I don't think Jordan should, I don't think he should dodge the question, okay? So, I'll put my cards on the table because that's what you're asking for me. You're asking for me to be honest. I'm a non-theist, okay, which is neither a theist nor an atheist. A non-theist says that they reject the shared presuppositions between at least classical theism and atheism, right? That God is a kind of being, that the relationship to him is one of belief, that God is in some important ways similar to person, etc. Now, why? Why do I reject that? But let me then tell you why I'm not an atheist too. Okay? Why do I reject that? Because I have practiced deeply in multiple traditions. It's like, arguing, if you've never been to Spain and somebody tells you, like, Spain is wonderful, well, how do you, but if Spain is better than France, but if they've never left Spain. Spain is better than France, but I've never left. But if I've been to both Spain and France, and I say Spain is better than France, you pay better attention to me. So I've practiced in many traditions, and I've had profound transformations and experiences of sacredness. Now, what do I mean by sacredness? Now, I don't know what your particular conception of God is. I know that many mystics talk about God this way. My experience is a very Neoplatonic experience in the sense that what I mean by sacredness is there is an aspect to reality that, like, realness always has a moreness to it. There's an inexhaustibleness to it. I cannot, through insight, exhaust the depths of what can be discovered or uncovered about even this object right here. Everything, like Blake said, you can see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower. You can hold infinity in the palm of your hand and spend eternity in an hour. I've had those experiences, but I've had them while doing Taoist practice, while doing deep in meditation. And that inexhaustibleness is not like a random chaos. It's an inexhaustible fount of new intelligibility. So I think for that reason, and again, and I've seen things in the Islamic traditions that say things like this. And I don't know if it's heretical or not, so I don't mean any offense. But, God is no thing. There's the no thingness of God. God is not any kind of thing. And so I think that part of, for example, like what makes a video game more real to people is if it has that moreness. That they can keep uncovering more, and when they uncover more, it makes more sense to them. So for me, science actually points that out about reality. The people like Dawkins, that Hamza rightly criticizes, are idolatrous. And I use that term seriously. Like, this set of beliefs is done. That's it. My experience is what science shows is that reality, like the Tao Te Ching says about the Tao, it is a well that is used but never used up. And so I've had radical experiences that transform, experiences of overwhelming oneness, what properly called mystical. I've had many of these, and when I compare them to people in various traditions, and I don't mean just abstractly, I mean in close, respectful discussion, there seems to be deep resonance, mutual understanding. But I cannot find any tradition that I can privilege that for. So I'm a non-theist. Now, that's why I'm hesitant. I don't want, and this is what I want to say as well. I believe strongly, given what I've just said, I think it's an implication of what I'm arguing for, that there are things that will be symbolic for a particular tradition that are indispensable for that tradition to experience the sacred. Let me give you an analogy of what I mean. English is indispensable to me. If you take it away from me, I can't think of reason. Does that mean I think that everybody has to speak English in order to be a cognitive agent? No. But it's indispensable to me. I literally can't live without it. But that's not the same as concluding that everybody has to be speaking English to be a cognitive agent. That's my reason for being a non-theist. Because
right? And by the way, as a scientist, the evidence lines up with this. People, and we have all kinds of measures for this, you'll just have to trust me on this, because, right? Of how wise people are becoming. Now, what's a strong prediction of how wise you become? Path immersion. How much you commit to a spiritual path and stick to it. All the spiritual traditions outperform the atheists in the ability to become wiser. But what you don't find is any significant difference between the various paths in how wise the people become within them. You have to commit. You have to immerse yourself in a path, because that reliably does better than the non-spiritual people, than the people who self-declare as atheists. It does. But the Buddhists and the Muslims, neither one outperforms the other. So from my point of view, it's like, I can't conclude that this. But I can also conclude why, and this is why and I mean this sincerely, why I deeply respect people in the tradition. From my point of view, I know you're not going to agree with what I'm going to say, but I'm explaining my position. From my point of view, your secret symbols very likely are deeply indispensable to you, and you cannot live without them. And that's why I do not trespass against them. That's my answer. So I'm not giving a Jordan answer. I'm not dodging. I'm telling you what I believe and why I believe. And I'm also trying to explain to you why I really do respect what you have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The way to try and articulate this in a way that makes it sound universal and applicable to everybody, from my perspective, would be, there's a really powerful verse in the Quran, in I think chapter 39, verse 29, that talks about the conditions of two people. And the Quran basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, consider the condition of two people. The one person is at service, is a slave to many masters and they're all quarreling. And another person is a slave or at service or relates to, if you like, to one master. Whose condition is best? Now, one of the main reasons why I think many people adopt Islam as the tradition is probably, from an existential point of view, this verse. Because if you really think about it, see, the concept of worship in the Islamic tradition is not just like lighting a candle and just going somewhere on a Sunday or a Friday, whatever the case may be. But rather, it's deeply profound. It has a multi-layered type of meaning. So it's knowing the divine, loving the divine, obeying the divine, and that includes being humbled before the divine, and singling out your acts of worship to the divine, the internal acts of worship and the external acts of worship, which have meaning. Now you could abstract that and make it universal. So is there something in our lives at some point in our existence that we want to know the most? Is there something or some idea or some entity or whatever the case may be that we love the most at some point in our existence? Is there something that we refer to the most at some point in our existence? Even it could even be temporary, right? Is there something that we express acts of worship to the most, like gratitude, utmost, ultimate gratitude? Now, whether you're a theist, non-theist, atheist, if you're a human being, I think you're going to be doing these things. You're going to want to know something the most at some point in your life. You're loving something the most at some point in your life, and that can change, of course, but you're going to be loving something the most at one point in your life. You're going to be obeying something or referring to something the most at one point in your life, and you're going to be directing acts of worship to something the most at one point in your life. And that could be an internal thing, like love or reliance, or it could be external acts of worship. So from that point of view, according to this, by virtue of what I've just said, everyone is in a state of worship, right? So what the Islamic tradition came to do was to simply show that the one that is worthy of that worship, in essence, worthy to be related to in this way, to be known, to be loved, to be obeyed, and to direct your acts of worship to, is the one who is worthy of worship. Now that is not an intellectual exercise. And it's not just mystical and spiritual. It's a combination of various factors. And that's why everyone is on their journey. And that's why Islam can account for your experiences of oneness. That's why Islam can account for other people's spiritual experiences. Because the fundamental thing that's going on here is you're expressing these things in some way. And what Islam came to do was to correct it. And correct it, I don't mean in kind of an abstract philosophical way, to show, hey, this is the being that you should be related to, right? With regards to knowledge, love, obedience, and directing acts of worship to. The other thing I would suggest from a naturalistic perspective, I always found this very difficult, and when I spoke to my sister about this once. I found spiritual practice within a naturalistic paradigm extremely problematic, and this is probably just me being ignorant here. I felt that it was equivalent in some way of self-worship. I know that sounds really bad, and I don't mean it that way. From the point of view that we are chasing a feeling, right? We are chasing an experience, we are chasing oneness, we are chasing even the sense of contentment, which is not a problem. But in the Islamic spiritual tradition, these are byproducts, they're not goals, right? The goal is the divine, relating to the divine. The byproduct is how you feel as a result of relating to the divine. And that's why you could be worshipping the divine, but sometimes you won't feel great, right? Because maybe you're present, you're not present, or whatever the case may be. But your main sense of purpose is being fulfilled by worshiping the divine, irrespective of the feeling. So, because I used to engage in Tibetan Buddhism before I became Muslim, right? Which is very fascinating, yeah? And there are some conversions as well, absolutely, with like the inner dimensions of prayer in Islam, all of these things. But for me, I felt spirituality was always about relating to the thing that actually created you, rather than relating to something within the cosmos. Because fundamentally, in my view, from a naturalistic point of view, that is reduced to what? Just electrons whizzing around. And I felt that doesn't give you any meaning, right? But that could be me giving the wrong meaning to it. Of course, I do appreciate that. So, do you appreciate the fact that maybe some theists or Muslims would say, this sounds great, right? But isn't it just reduced to just chasing a feeling, and those feelings are in a subjective state, conscious state, which can be further reduced to electrons just whizzing around? So ultimately, where is the meaning? Does that make sense?
Sure, that's a fair question.
So let me address the first part. I think the fundamental things that I found in all of these traditions is a deep kind of conversion. I've talked about transformative experience, and and I've also talked about this. It's a conversion from ego centrism to ontocentrism. So, and what you could show is that this is like the difference between navigating the world in an egocentric fashion, what's in front of me, what's behind me, and navigating the world allocentrically, north, south, east, west. I'm using that as an analogy. And what happens and I agree, is there a lot of spiritual narcissism? Of course there is. Is one of the things the West is being idolatrous about is a kind of spiritual narcissism? Yes. So if what you're doing in spirituality is the following: look at my wonderful spiritual experience, and I'm going to put it on a shelf because it shows how unique I am, how special I am, how much you should pay attention to me, all the features of narcissism, then yes, I reject that. But in the people that I study, and I hope what I see in my own life, and people say that's what they see in my life, people often report changes in me before I realize them in myself. Those are the ones I pay attention to. Those are the ones I pay the most attention to. What I see is a change from being egocentric to being reality-centric. And then in that sense, and here's where I think it does, I think at least shade into what you're talking about, in that I think the ground of being the ground of reality is, again, no kind of thing, and that any attempt to think you have a stable grasp of it is idolatrous. And so I'll use a Christian theologian here, Paul Tillich. You should only have ultimate concern for what you think is most ultimately real. Now, do I think the ultimately real is just electrons whizzing around? No, I don't think so. I'm a non-reductive physicalist, and here's the reason why. Look, the electrons and the all the particles and the forces are identical. They're identical. Space and time, identical. All of this difference is real, because if the difference isn't real,
all the patterns in the information it's making aren't real. And if the information patterns aren't real, then the science that is based on them isn't real. And then the science that's supposed to tell me that there's just electrons isn't real. Science presupposes the reality of the differentiated information at this level. It's not just an epistemic thing. There are ontological levels. And I think getting into a relationship with those, this is a Platonic argument, getting in relationship to those patterns of intelligibility is a way of getting in contact with aspects of realness that don't just simply reduce to the electrons. And again, to add one more touch to it, I don't think that meaning is in the patterns or in my subjective experience, it's not just a feeling, is that am I in a real relationship to what is most real in a way that affords me to get into a deeper relationship with what's more real than that, which affords me to get into a real relationship with what's more real with that, and so on and so forth. That's my experience of spirituality.
Not to respond, but just to comment, like, the real is one of God's names. Right?
Yeah.
So in the Islamic tradition is al-haq,
Yeah.
the reality, the truth, which is very, very interesting from that point.
I think that's amazing. I think that's very important.
I actually think you're amazing. I don't mean that in flattery, by the way. I think because I've had discussions with academics before, and this is actually quite unique, to be honest. Like this, a lot of things have converged. I've learned, again, a lot. If I see you next year, I'll probably repeat some of the things I learned, just like what I've done today. So I really thank you for your presence and for your time from that point of view.
Well, first of all, I want to reciprocate. Every time I come here, and I don't mean this in a facile way, and the questioner is right, and there's a legitimate criticism being made. I'm not trying to foist something on you, but my understanding of Islam is limited, and I've tried to show you what experience I have, and I've not tried to claim anything about that. In fact, I've been hesitant, out of respect. But, on the other hand, from the limited amount I know and how I can connect it via our discussion to the cognitive science I know, you repeatedly deepen my appreciation for Islam. Thank you.
I think time is getting a bit tight. Maybe we have time for one more question, especially at the rate that these answers are incredibly long and interesting. So,
thanks very much. Doctor, my question for you is that
Sorry, I couldn't see who was speaking.
Someone once pointed out to me that one of the reasons the rise of secularism and atheism today is a byproduct of the feeling that because of the technological superiority that we've achieved in the modern era, relatively speaking, we look at religions of a bygone era as also being antiquated, primitive, that we don't need this anymore because it is not because of religion we've achieved our successes of today. He argued, or he suggested that one of the ways to counter that notion is to show that earlier civilizations were also technologically advanced, so much so that even at that time they had knowledge of things that we are not familiar of or aware of today. I mean, for example, navigation using, the stars, or the knowledge of making the pyramids, for example. I mean, archaeologists are still dumbfounded by that. That was one point he was trying to make, and that was that because of the rise of technology and science that has given the Western powers or the modern world superiority, they equate that as being, well, it wasn't religion that got us here, so why do we need it? Obviously it's irrelevant in our lives. Also because of how the restrictions of religion as well. We can't, that apparent belief that we can't enjoy life, with religion. There's always all these restrictions, whereas here we're free. By extension, though, and someone else pointed out that with the decline of religion, we also have a rise in activism, like human rights, women's rights, the environment. That concern is that, which also shows that we are just not hedonistic animals, eat, sleep, and procreate. Could you comment on that, Doctor? And by all means, Sheikh Hamza, can you chime in if you feel like?
So, I'm going to answer in one way, but I'm going to refer it to you. I have the series out there, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which tries to trace the history of this. And you pointed to both things, the rise of secularism and
the rise of the issue that why do people turn to activism, and of course not denying that there might be legitimate socioeconomic reasons, but there is also, and I think you're alluding to this, there's also the quest for meaning. There's
Right.
quest to belong to something larger than oneself. I took that to be part of what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay, so I guess I would respond first by rejecting the claim of the person you're referring to. So to study very carefully why and how secularism arose and why religion went into decline in the West is a very hard thing to do. I take 25 hours to do it in the series. I'm serious. And so I know you're just reporting somebody else, so I'm not trying to shoot the messenger. Please accept that. I'm sort of, I almost want to say viscerally opposed to simplistic accounts of why secularism arose and why the meaning crisis has arose. You can point to significant changes in how people were reading texts in the 12th century that was a significant contributor to the rise of nominalism within Occam, and then that sets into action a kind of change in how people think about meaning and belief. But belief goes from beleben, which means to give your heart, to assertion of proposition, because of the way people are reading differently. And then that leads into Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and the and also this. What are the most secular countries, the countries that are the most secular, where people are the least religious? It's also correlated where people live, the most people live by themselves. Living by yourself, a society that has more people living by themselves as individuals, atomistically, is a society that will have lower and lower levels, and this is in Scandinavian countries, by the way, have lower and lower levels of religious belief. The causes of why people, right, and if you look at why people, the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, not nuns, the people who write on the census, it's not correlated with I deeply understand science. In fact, the new atheism movement, the hegemony of the new atheism movement is seriously in decline. And even though it's declining, the nuns are still the most rapidly increasing demographic. This is what I'm saying. These kinds of propositions or proposals as to why secularism and issues of meaning are arising, I think are too simplistic. And so I can't give you the whole argument here. I'm just trying to point you. But if you want, I literally 25 hours of trying to get how did we get here and why are we here and what. So do the history, and also some of the things I've alluded to here. How does that line up with our best cognitive science of what humans are doing when they're trying to make meaning, when they're trying to cultivate wisdom, and try to get the most powerful convergence between them? And I take that question so deeply and seriously. I spent a lot of time because the argument is incredibly complex if we're going to try and be as truthful to both the historical and the scientific facts that we can.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
To add to that, I think it's quite important to understand the role of individualism in historically.
Yes. Yeah. And it's correlated with the Protestant Reformation.
Absolutely. So obviously, previously to the kind of rise of individualism, you had this understanding that there was God's perceived will for society, and that the individual's identity was contingent to his relations within a group. Now that changed fundamentally, that the individual had primacy. And Professor John Chauvet, he writes about this in his introduction to, when he talks about the liberal project in human rights, and he talks about kind of a brief history of liberalism, and he talks about how the role of individualism in liberalism, right? Obviously, I know liberalism is a disputatious set of doctrines, but it's not like here's liberalism. It's many things, of course. So I think individualism has a role to play in what's happened with Scandinavia and other countries. And what's interesting, when you atomize the individual, and from this point of view, the feminist philosopher Marilyn Friedman, she says individualism is the kind of taking the individual, abstracting their ways from society, and divorcing any kind of sense of social obligation, right? That doesn't mean people don't have empathy and they feel they should help people, but the kind of social obligation as if they were their identity was contingent to those social relations, right? And when you individualize a human being, what happens? What happens is you have a false sense of self-sufficiency, right? Which is very interesting when the Quran talks about the you think you're self-sufficient. that becomes a barrier to divine guidance and mercy. Now, because self-sufficiency is actually delusional, right? Like, the older you get, right, and the more kids you have, and the more people you meet, and the more positive and negative experiences you have, you realize you're not really in control, man.
Go through grief. Grief will show you.
Absolutely. And I find it very shocking that if you're always happy, then you're in a state of ghafla, you're heedless. There's something wrong with you. You haven't had insights. Like, if you really understand what's happening in the world, there's going to be something that is going to be bothering you, right? And maybe, thank God for Western civilization in a way, right? Because if you took away religion and you didn't replace it with something, I think everybody would kill themselves or something, right? I know that's a very harsh statement to make. And thank God there was something else, temporarily, hopefully, which is, that kind of capitalism, it's, the worldly stuff, the computer games, always always doing things, right? Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, listening to stuff. Because if you were chasing those are ephemeral things, then, oh my God, you'd be like, what's going on? Anyway, the point is sorry, it's going off on a little rant there, but individualism, from this point of view, you have this false sense of self-sufficiency, and the Quran says, the one who thinks is self-sufficient, that's like a barrier to divine mercy and guidance. Now, what's interesting is the Quran spends a lot of time to show you that you are actually dependent. You're not individual, you're individual. Because let's think about it for one moment. Like, you take the 22nd chapter of the Quran, it talks about the life cycle of the human being. You were a baby. Let's reflect properly, have insight on what it means to be a baby, right? You can't feed yourself. That should move you. Because someone else was doing that for you. Isn't that moving? If that's not moving, then we have issues, man. You couldn't feed yourself. You couldn't wipe your own posterior. You needed touch and love and affection. If you take a newborn baby and you put it in the corner of a room and you don't interact with it, it will die. And some of us, we think we're catapulted from a mother's womb with a briefcase and a tie and a bank balance. Isn't that true? And like, us being here today is as a result of almost an infinite number of variables that you had no control over. And the Islamic tradition spends a lot of time to show you all of those things are fundamentally dependent on the one who is independent, right? And that changes something, right? So I would argue this from an Islamic paradigm point of view that living on your own, maybe it's because you're self-sufficient, you don't need anyone, maybe it creates that kind of self-sufficiency, and it creates a delusion, it becomes a barrier to divine guidance and mercy, and if you close the door to divine guidance and mercy, that is basically almost rejecting him too. So
it also entraps you in egocentrism. So part of the problem with people...
By the way, let's define egocentrism as a cognitive bias that your way of seeing the world is the only way of seeing the world.
Well, it's hard for you to see things from perspective. So little kids tend to be extremely egocentric, right? And so part of maturity is to become less egocentric. But I can step back and take a perspective on my perspective if I have internalized how you have taken a perspective. We grow our metacognitive ability to overcome egocentrism by living in the presence of other people and having their perspectival knowing impact and shape our perspective. So you know this. Your friend is doing the same strange, stupid thing in their romantic relationships that they've done before. And they can't see it. And you see it so clearly from the outside. And you feel like Solomon. Oh, I'm so wise. But then when you're in the middle of it, man, did you see it? No. Now what's really interesting, and Igor Grossman has done research, that's a real thing. If I give you one of those problems and ask you to try and solve it, you know what you'll do without thinking? You'll explain it from a first-person perspective, and you'll be all wrapped in all the biases. And then I'll ask you to do the following. Try and describe it from the third-person perspective, as if Tom over there was describing it. The people will then do that, and then they'll suddenly realize, oh. Now, I'm speaking as a non-theist and a naturalist, but I think one of the things that happens when you relate to something like God is you get a transcendent perspective on your perspective that can take you dramatically outside of your egocentrism. But I think when you live alone, you don't get practice even with other human perspectives that transcend you and reveal your bias. And so that, because you don't have that intermediate direct experience, relating to something of an even greater or more encompassing perspective becomes unthinkable to you.
Not that you can't make propositions about it, but you can't enter into the perspective from which it is present to you. Now, that is completely consistent with what you said about the self-reliance. But I would add that as another dimension.
I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and I want to ask you all to give a round of applause to both of our panelists. I know I benefited a lot, and there's so many things you said that are just making connections in my head too. And of course, Hamza Tzortzis, connecting it to our Islamic tradition, I think was incredibly important. Please, if you have time, stay behind and absolutely give thanks to both of our panelists for coming out and spending their time with us here. I want to thank you all for coming out, and hopefully everybody has a safe drive home.
I would like to say once again, thank you. I know that I don't share many of your beliefs, but I deeply appreciate the intellectual respect and hospitality that I was shown. And I got a definite sense of, and I mean this without pun or insult intended, I got a sense of good faith in entering into discussion and dialogue. And that matters more to me ultimately, because again, don't tell me what you believe, tell me what you practice.
I'd like to echo that. We met last year and I learned some significant, you can't even call it a concept now, but I related to what he said last year, and I even expressed it in this room today. So it's very important, I think, to talk about these things and not to be afraid to have intellectual discourse and discussion and to relate to each other in this way, even if you feel there are differences. Because as long as you do it within the spirit of civility, tolerance and kindness, and having sincerity and being committed to the well-being of other people. Because the prophetic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad upon him be peace said, love for humanity what you love for yourself. The Arabic is linnas, for people, for humanity. And the traditional scholars, when they talk about loving for others what you love for yourself, it means you love goodness for them and you love guidance for them. So if you sincerely are committed to other people's well-being, it's extremely important because it would help engage facilitate these type of discussions. And the final thing I want to say is, so when you talk about these differences, the differences are usually the basis for anxiety and fear. But if you show the human relevance of that difference, or the meaning behind it, then hopefully that fear doesn't turn into anxieties and hatred, but rather it turns into mutual cooperation or some kind of sense of coexistence. Affection, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
And don't we need more of that right now?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So hopefully we could do this again. Thank you very much.
I have felt both times welcome. So if you wish me to come back, I'm happy to come back.
Thank you. Thank you.